Late autumn cast its golden hues over the quiet suburban street where Mia had recently moved. Her new house, though modest, had a cozy charm that filled her with hope for a fresh start. The neighbors seemed friendly, especially the Landrys, the retired couple across the street, who greeted her with warm smiles and cheerful waves. Yet, it was the house next door, a gray, neglected structure that appeared abandoned, that drew her curiosity. At first, Mia thought no one lived there. The windows were grimy, the yard overgrown, and she never saw anyone come or go. But late at night, when the rest of the street was silent, she would hear sounds. Footsteps creaked across the wooden floor. Faint humming drifted through the walls, and once, she could swear she heard laughter, low and guttural. She asked Mrs. Landry about the house during one of their friendly chats. The woman's face darkened. "That's the old Rayner place," she said quietly. "It's been empty for years. Best to leave it alone, dear." That night, Mia couldn't sleep. The noises next door had grown louder, thumping, dragging, and an occasional sharp crack, like wood snapping. Frustrated, she convinced herself it was her imagination. Maybe animals had gotten inside. She decided to investigate. The next evening, armed with a flashlight, Mia slipped through the side gate into the Rayner yard. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of rotting wood. She approached the back door, which hung slightly ajar. A single push sent it creaking open, revealing a dark hallway. Inside, the house was in disarray. Broken furniture lay scattered, and the wallpaper was peeling in long, damp strips. Yet what unsettled Mia most was the feeling of being watched. Her skin prickled as if unseen eyes followed her every move. She found herself in a small living room where a tattered armchair faced a blank television screen. The air was unnervingly cold. A sudden noise made her jump, a thud from upstairs, followed by hurried footsteps. Mia froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Hello," she called, her voice barely audible. No response. Summoning her courage, she crept up the staircase, each step groaning under her weight. At the top, the hallway was pitch black, except for a faint glow emanating from one of the rooms. As she approached, she heard the humming again, low and melodic. Pushing the door open, she found a child's room. The glow came from a cracked lamp, casting eerie shadows on the walls. In the center of the room stood a small rocking horse, moving ever so slightly, its creak echoing in the silence. A chill ran down Mia's spine as she noticed the words scrawled across the walls in jagged letters, "Leave." Before she could react, heavy footsteps pounded behind her. Whirling around, she caught a glimpse of a tall, shadowy figure rushing toward her. She bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping in her haste to escape. Behind her, the sound of the door slamming shut reverberated through the night. Mia fled back to her house, her heart racing. The noises stopped after that, but the next morning, the Landrys were gone, their home eerily empty. And as Mia peered out her window, she noticed something chilling. The curtains in the Rayner house were now drawn open, revealing a shadowy figure watching her. Rachel had always been drawn to the peaceful charm of suburban life. Moving into her new home one summer felt like the fresh start she needed after a tough divorce. Her neighbors appeared friendly and unassuming until she got to know the couple next door. The Millers had lived in the house next door for years. They were an older couple, their faces weathered by time, but always friendly when they saw Rachel. But something about their house unsettled her. The blinds were perpetually drawn, and the yard was often overgrown with weeds. Every time Rachel would wave, Mrs. Miller would smile politely, but never speak much beyond pleasantries. It wasn't until a few weeks after she moved in that Rachel began to notice strange things. At night, when the house next door was dark and silent, she would sometimes hear faint sounds, soft thumping noises, like someone pacing the floor. Other times she'd hear muffled voices, but when she listened closely, they sounded distorted and inhuman. Rachel tried to shake it off, but one evening, as she was sitting in her living room, she saw something that made her blood run cold. She glanced out the window and noticed the Millers standing in their yard. Mrs. Miller was facing the street, her back to the house. But Mr. Miller, he wasn't there. Instead, she saw him standing in the darkened window, staring at her, motionless. That night, the thumping and whispering sounds were louder than ever. Terrified, Rachel called the police, but when they arrived, the house was as quiet as ever. The Millers were there, sitting in their living room, acting as if nothing had happened. The next morning, Rachel decided to confront Mrs. Miller. When she knocked on the door, Mrs. Miller answered with a polite smile, but Rachel could see the fear in her eyes. "Is everything okay?" Rachel asked. Mrs. Miller's smile faltered. "We're just fine," Mrs. Miller replied, her voice shaky. "Sometimes we hear things too." That was the last time Rachel spoke to Mrs. Miller. A few days later, the Millers disappeared. No moving truck, no goodbye, just an empty house. Rachel never heard from them again. But late at night, sometimes she still hears the faint thumping and whispering from next door, as though the house is still occupied by something else. Ben had spent over a decade in his tranquil suburban neighborhood, a place where the most excitement came from the rare lawn dispute or a lost cat poster. So when a new family moved into the house at the end of the street, it quickly became the talk of the community. The Thompsons moved in quickly, their truck unloading late at night. Ben noticed them only in passing a husband, a wife, and a boy about 8 years old. They didn't mingle, kept their curtains closed, and avoided eye contact during their rare appearances. Ben thought it was odd, but he figured they just needed time to settle in. It wasn't long before whispers began spreading. Mrs. Kelly, the nosy neighbor 2 doors down, claimed she saw the boy wandering alone late at night. Others said they'd heard strange noises banging, muffled shouting from the Thompsons' house. Ben dismissed it as gossip until the night he saw the boy standing in the middle of the street. It was 11 p.m., and Ben had gone out to take his trash to the curb. That's when he saw the kid barefoot and shivering under the streetlight. "Hey, are you okay?" Ben called out. The boy didn't answer. He just stared, his eyes wide and scared. Before Ben could approach, the kid bolted back toward his house, disappearing into the dark. The incident nagged at Ben, but what could he do? Kids act weird sometimes. Then things got worse. One evening, as Ben was reading in his living room, he heard a sharp, frantic knock on his door. He opened it to find the Thompson boy standing there, trembling. "Please," the boy whispered, "help me." Before Ben could respond, Mr. Thompson appeared at the curb. "Sorry about that," he said, his voice calm but firm. He grabbed the boy's arm. "He's not supposed to be out here." Ben hesitated, sensing something was wrong. "Is everything okay?" "Of course," Mr. Thompson replied, his grip on the boy tightening. "He just sleepwalks sometimes." The boy's wide eyes said otherwise. But what could Ben do? He nodded reluctantly, watching as Mr. Thompson led the boy back home. Over the next few nights, Ben barely slept. He couldn't shake the image of the terrified boy. Then came the screaming. It was faint at first, like the wind, but it grew louder, a high-pitched, desperate sound echoing through the night. It was coming from the Thompsons' house. Ben called the police, convinced something horrible was happening. When the officers arrived, the Thompsons were calm, almost too calm. They let the police into search, and nothing seemed amiss. The boy was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. He didn't even look at Ben as the officers left. That was the last time Ben saw the Thompsons. The next morning, their house was empty. No moving trucks, no goodbyes, just gone. But what haunted Ben most was what he found on his porch, a small handprint smudged in dirt, along with a note that simply read, "Thank you." For weeks after, Ben swore he could feel eyes watching him from the vacant house. At night, when the wind was just right, he thought he could still hear faint whispers calling for help. Those whispers always seemed to come from the direction of the empty house with the curtains drawn tight. As the family reflects on their time in the haunted apartment in Al-Karama, the memories of eerie encounters and unexplained events linger in their minds. The constant whispers, sightings, and unsettling experiences had a profound impact on their lives, leaving them in a perpetual state of unease. Despite their efforts to coexist with the entity, the tension and fear proved too overwhelming. Eventually, the family decided to move out, seeking peace and normalcy elsewhere. The haunted apartment remains a chilling reminder of their brush with the supernatural. This story serves as a testament to the mysterious and often terrifying nature of the unknown. Today, we unravel the eerie story of a haunted apartment in the bustling neighborhood of Al-Karama. Imagine moving into what seems like a perfect home, only to discover it is anything but ordinary. This story is not just about unexplained noises or fleeting shadows, it's about a family who faced the unexplainable and the terrifying. So turn off the lights, sit back, and prepare yourself as we dive into the unsettling events that turned a simple apartment into a place of perpetual fear. Our story begins in 2003, when our protagonist moved from Lahore to Dubai, unknowingly stepping into a world where the line between reality and the supernatural is blurred. This is not just a tale, it's a warning of what happens when the past refuses to stay buried and comes back to haunt the present. Our tale begins in 2003 with our protagonist, a young professional from Lahore, making a life-changing move to Dubai. Seeking new opportunities and adventures, they settled in the bustling neighborhood of Al Karama. The apartment they found seemed perfect at first, a cozy two-bedroom unit on a quiet street. Its warm and welcoming atmosphere masked the dark secrets it held. However, whispers among the locals hinted at a troubled past. The building had stood for decades, witnessing countless lives pass through its walls. There were rumors of mysterious disappearances and unexplained deaths, but our protagonist, eager to start anew, brushed these stories aside. Upon moving in, the protagonist couldn't help but notice an odd feeling. The apartment was eerily silent, the air thick with an almost tangible tension. The layout was simple, a small living room leading to the kitchen, with 2 bedrooms down a narrow hallway. Yet, it felt like someone or something was always watching. On the first night, they lay awake, unable to shake the sense of unease. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and the silence was occasionally broken by faint, indistinguishable noises. It was then that they had their first eerie encounter, a chilling whisper that seemed to come from nowhere, sending shivers down their spine and confirming their worst fears. This was no ordinary apartment. The first night alone in the apartment was unsettling for the protagonist. As he lay in bed, trying to adjust to the unfamiliar surroundings, an inexplicable sense of unease washed over him. The apartment was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. Despite his best efforts to ignore it, the feeling of being watched was inescapable. As the clock ticked past midnight, the atmosphere grew heavier, almost suffocating. Suddenly, a faint whisper echoed through the room, sending chills down his spine. He sat up, heart pounding, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The whispering ceased, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, with every shadow and sound magnified by his growing fear. He couldn't shake the sensation that he was not alone, that something unseen was lurking just beyond his field of vision. This marked the beginning of a series of eerie encounters that would challenge his perception of reality and test his courage. As the days passed, the once tranquil apartment began to betray signs of an unseen presence. It started with whispers, faint, almost imperceptible murmurs that seemed to drift through the walls. At first, the protagonist thought it was just the neighbors, but the eerie feeling persisted even during the quietest hours. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and undeniably unsettling. It felt as though someone or something was trying to communicate. The protagonist would often feel a cold breeze brush past, despite all the windows being shut tight. Shadows flickered in the corner of their vision, but when they turned to look, nothing was there. A feeling of being watched became a constant companion, gnawing at the edges of their sanity. The protagonist's sleep was disrupted by the sensation of someone standing over them, watching, waiting. These occurrences were not limited to just the protagonist. Family members began to share their own experiences. The mother, while cooking in the kitchen, felt a cold hand on her shoulder, only to turn around and find no one there. Doors would creak open on their own, lights flickered inexplicably, and objects seemed to move of their own accord. The unease grew into a palpable fear, and the realization dawned that they were not alone in the apartment. Something sinister was lurking in the shadows, making its presence known in the most chilling ways. It wasn't long before the entire family began to experience the unsettling presence in the apartment. One evening, the mother was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she felt a cold breeze brush against her neck. She turned around, expecting to see someone, but found nothing. The whispers became more frequent, often sounding like distant conversations that abruptly stopped when anyone tried to listen closely. The children reported seeing shadows moving along the walls and hearing footsteps in the hallway, even when no one was there. One particularly disturbing incident involved the father, who woke up in the middle of the night to see the figure of a man standing at the foot of his bed, only to vanish moments later. These experiences left the family on edge, constantly looking over their shoulders and questioning their sanity. The haunting presence seemed to be growing stronger, feeding off their fear and uncertainty, making them dread each passing day. The most terrifying night began like any other. The protagonist was alone, the rest of the family out for the evening. As the night deepened, an unsettling silence enveloped the apartment, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock. Suddenly, a cold draft brushed past, though all windows were firmly shut. The protagonist's heart raced, a sense of impending doom creeping in. Then it happened. Out of the corner of their eye, they caught a glimpse of movement in the dimly lit corridor. Turning their heads slowly, they saw her, a ghostly female figure, shrouded in a misty, ethereal glow, standing motionless at the end of the hallway. Her eyes, hollow and lifeless, seemed to pierce through the protagonist's soul. Paralyzed with fear, the protagonist could barely breathe, every muscle tense and rigid. The figure began to move, gliding silently closer. The protagonist screamed to run, but their body wouldn't respond. Just as the figure reached out a translucent hand, it vanished, leaving the protagonist in utter darkness, drenched in cold sweat. This night marked the peak of their terror, solidifying the reality of the haunting and leaving an indelible scar on their psyche. The protagonist, growing weary of the relentless disturbances, decided it was time to confront whatever was sharing the apartment. One evening, alone in the dimly lit living room, they gathered the courage to speak out loud. With a trembling voice, they addressed the unseen presence, hoping for a response. "If there is someone here, I mean no harm. I just want to live in peace. Can we coexist?" The silence that followed was deafening, yet strangely it brought a sense of calm. Days passed, and the atmosphere in the apartment seemed lighter, as if an unspoken truth had been established. The whispers and footsteps that once haunted the nights were now infrequent, almost as if the entity had agreed to the protagonist's request. This tentative peace allowed the family to breathe a little easier, but the undercurrent of unease never fully dissipated. They knew they were not alone, but the acknowledgement seemed to bring a fragile harmony. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant vigilance and respect for the unseen resident. After the protagonist got married, the dynamic in the haunted apartment began to shift once more. The arrival of his cousin, who moved in to help with household chores, brought new energy into the space but also seemed to stir up the supernatural entities that had been lying dormant. From the very first night, the cousin reported hearing strange noises, like faint whispers, and saw footsteps echoing through the hallways, even though everyone was asleep. The unsettling sounds were only the beginning. Objects in the kitchen would move inexplicably. Utensils that were neatly placed on the counter would be found scattered across the floor the next morning. Cupboards that were securely closed would be wide open, with contents sometimes thrown out in disarray. The family, trying to make sense of these occurrences, could not help but feel a growing tension and fear. The cousin's experiences became more unnerving. One evening, she was alone in the kitchen preparing dinner when she felt an icy breath on the back of her neck, sending chills down her spine. Turning around, she saw nothing but felt a heavy, oppressive presence. The most disturbing event happened when she discovered what appeared to be chewed bones hidden behind the refrigerator. This gruesome find reinforced the family's belief that something otherworldly was sharing their home, something that was not just a benign spirit but a malevolent force. Despite attempts to ignore or rationalize these events, the palpable fear and constant unease made it clear that the spirits were not willing to be ignored. The family's resolve to live peacefully was being tested by the relentless supernatural activities, and each day brought new challenges and fears. The cousin's experiences in the apartment were equally unnerving. Not long after moving in, she began to notice peculiar activities. The most disturbing incident happened one night when she heard strange noises coming from the kitchen. Investigating, she found the kitchen in disarray, with utensils scattered and cabinets open. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. One morning, she found chewed bones on the kitchen floor, bones that no one in the household could account for. This discovery deepened the family's fear and suspicion that a supernatural presence was indeed inhabiting their home. The cousin, once skeptical, now firmly believed they were not alone. These eerie encounters added to the growing list of unexplainable events, solidifying their belief in the paranormal. The family was left to grapple with the constant fear and anxiety, questioning their every move and decision while living in that haunted apartment.